There's something deeply wrong with California's national forests, and the authorities don't want you to know about it. A developmentally disabled boy vanishes near a Sierra Nevada cabin, only to be found 9 days later impossibly high on a ridge. A grieving Native American chief's curse continues to claim victims in one specific area almost 200 years later. And a routine camping trip in Sequoia turns into a nightmare when something massive leads to memories of missing time and yellow-eyed beings. In this episode, I'm going to take you through 3 cases that reveal a disturbing pattern hidden within California's wilderness areas, one that suggests these places were never meant for us. I'm Josh D'Onofrio. This is What Lurks Beneath. You won't want to miss this one. On the morning of June 23, 1992, a family of 4 from Oakhurst, California, was driving along Highway 88 through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Bob and Sharon Miller were in the front seats, and their 2 kids, 10-year-old Cindy and 12-year-old Kenny, were in the back. They'd been planning this trip for weeks, and everyone was excited to explore the beautiful area near Carson Pass, all along the Pacific Crest Trail. When they reached the trailhead in Alpine County, Bob pulled into the small parking area and everyone piled out of the car. The weather this day was perfect. I mean, you had clear blue skies, the sunshine was amazing. It was a gorgeous summer day. The family grabbed their day packs and they made sure everybody had water, and they began hiking into the wilderness. Now, the trail that they were on actually wound through an area called Mice Meadows, which sits at roughly 8,400 feet in elevation. And as they hiked along, they were surrounded by the stunning mountain views and alpine meadows with all the wildflowers. I mean, if you've ever been there, it's just spectacular. Now, the kids were having a great time, especially Kenny, who kept stopping to pick up really interesting rocks and sticks along the trail, like a lot of kids do. And after about 3 or so hours of hiking, the family came across something really cool. It was this old abandoned log cabin with a bar next to it that was known as Mice Cabin. As it turns out, it had actually been built decades earlier and was now this historical landmark that hikers still check out to this day. Bob and Sharon were immediately interested in exploring it, and Cindy ran ahead to peek inside. Kenny, though, wasn't near as interested in the old buildings. While his family went to investigate the cabin, he hung back about 100 feet, standing next to this little creek that ran alongside the trail. He was doing what he loved to do, picking up small pebbles and just tossing them into the water, watching the ripples they made. Bob and Sharon figured they'd just take a quick look inside and then continue on their hike. They could still hear Kenny behind them, so they knew he was fine, and they ducked inside and with Cindy to check it out. They didn't spend too long poking around, maybe 2 or 3 minutes at most, with Bob pointing out to Cindy how the pioneers had built these structures, that kind of thing. And when they emerged from the cabin and looked back toward the creek where Kenny had just been playing, he wasn't there. So Bob called out, "Kenny, time to go," but there was no response. It was just the sound of the creek flowing and the wind in the trees. Initially, Bob and Sharon weren't too worried. They figured Kenny had maybe wandered a little ways upstream or even downstream, still playing with his rocks. So they walked back to where they'd last seen him and began looking around, calling his name. But after about 10 minutes of searching the immediate area and not finding any sign of him, that's when panic started to set in. The thing is, Kenny wasn't just any typical 12-year-old boy. It would turn out that when Kenny was younger, he had contracted meningitis, and it had caused significant brain damage. Even though he was 12, mentally he functioned more like a 4-year-old. He had difficulties communicating, he didn't always understand danger, and worst of all, he required daily seizure medication that he didn't have with him on this day hike. Bob and Sharon, now in full panic mode, began frantically searching the area up and down, checking behind every boulder and tree, and they just kept calling his name over and over. And now his sister Cindy was crying, asking where her brother was he okay, what happened? But nobody knew anything, and there was no sign of Kenny anywhere. And after about an hour of just desperate searching, Bob had to make the difficult decision to hike back to their car as fast as possible. He looked right at Sharon and Cindy and just said, "Stay here at the cabin. I'm going to go look for help to get Kenny." And he ran the 3 miles back to the trailhead. By the time Bob reached a phone and called 911, it was already in the late afternoon. The Alpine County Sheriff's Department immediately launched a search operation, not wasting a second, and word spread pretty quickly to the nearby communities about this missing boy. That night, the news reached the Miller family's hometown of Oakhurst, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. People who knew the family, people who had never even met them, everybody wanted to help find Kenny. And at 1 a.m., just hours after Kenny had disappeared, over 50 volunteers had already gathered to join the search. And by sunrise, the search effort had grown into one of the largest operations the area had ever seen. I mean, you had Alpine County Sheriff's deputies, search and rescue teams from multiple counties, the Forest Service personnel, and hundreds of volunteers all looking for this boy. And it was impressive because at its peak, there were 250 people per day looking for Kenny. I mean, if you think, the area in which he vanished wasn't large enough for him to evade 250 people, especially if there's that many people looking for him per day. I mean, they even had helicopters, they had search dogs, all working the trails, people checking every single hiding spot possible, because everybody understood that time was critical. Not only because Kenny was developmentally disabled and couldn't care for himself, but also because he was just wearing a t-shirt and cotton pants. This is an area where temperatures drop significantly at night, and there is risk of dying of exposure if left to the elements. To make matters worse, the weather turned bad almost immediately. Storms rolled in, bringing rain, sleet, and even snow to the higher elevations. Searchers were battling horrible conditions, desperately trying to find this vulnerable boy. And over the next several days, they did find some clues. In fact, they discovered a child-sized sock that they believed was Kenny's, and they found small footprints in muddy areas that did match his shoe size. But despite following these leads, for some reason, they couldn't locate Kenny himself. The search teams were very thorough. They checked every canyon, every cluster of trees, every rocky outcropping, every nook and cranny where any confused child might take up shelter. They called his name until their voices were hoarse. They played recordings of his mother's voice over loudspeakers, just hoping he would recognize it and come toward the sound. But folks, day after day after day, all passed and there's no sign of the kid. 5 days, 6 days, it just added up. And storms continued to pound the area. Everybody involved knew that the chances of finding Kenny alive were diminishing rapidly. On July 2nd, 9 days after his disappearance, the official search was scaled back. It wasn't that people had given up hope, but the reality was that resources were limited and the chances of survival after that long in those conditions were pretty minimal. And most of the volunteers reluctantly went home. However, Mr. Miller refused to give up hope. Even after the search ended, he returned to the mountains every single day, searching on his own, and he would hike for hours, checking new areas, revisiting places that had already been searched, calling his son's name, but he didn't find anything either. On July 4th, 2 off-duty U.S. Forest Service workers were hiking in the area, and while not specifically searching for Kenny, but just out enjoying the day, they were up on a high ridge near Stevens Peak when one of them spotted something that didn't belong. At first, they thought it might be a pile of clothing that somebody had abandoned, but then they got closer and realized what they were looking at. It was a body, a small body. Immediately, they radioed for help, and Alpine County deputies responded to the scene. The location was at approximately 9,800 feet, way up on this steep, rocky ridge. Now, the winds were so strong that when they tried to bring in a California Highway Patrol copter to recover the body, it couldn't even land safely. So they had to send ground teams on horseback to make the journey up to the ridge. When they finally reached the body, the sheriff confirmed what everybody feared. It was indeed Kenny Miller. The autopsy would later determine that he had died from exposure, probably within just 1 or 2 days of going missing. There were no signs of foul play and no evidence of any attacks. He had simply succumbed to the cold and the storms. But there's a part that none of us understand, the detail that bothers everybody who worked on this. Kenny's body was found approximately 2 miles from where he vanished, and more incredibly, it was 1,500 feet higher in elevation. How does a disabled 12-year-old boy wearing just a t-shirt and pants somehow climb the equivalent of a 140-story building up a steep, rocky mountain? While hundreds of searchers were looking for him in the valleys and meadows below, Kenny had somehow climbed up into terrain that was so difficult to navigate that experienced park personnel had difficulty navigating. No one knows why he climbed the mountain. I mean, maybe he was confused and thought he was heading back to the car. Maybe he was trying to get to a high point where he could see better. Or maybe, in his childlike mind, he was just following some instinct that no one will understand. Or, of course, there's always the dark side of things. Yeah, if you're familiar with any missing 411 cases, your mind's already going there. And I just want to make note that this isn't fun. This is a horrible case that involves the tragic loss of life from a child. And being a parent, I can't even fathom the amount of pain that Bob and his wife have to endure every day. And where he was found, there's now a memorial spot. It includes a granite plaque inscribed with the words, "Our Little Angel, Heaven Bound," along with Kenny's name and dates. Some people have taken to calling that ridge Kenny Miller's Ridge, in memory of him and his final journey. And his story, like many others, is very important to tell because it's very important to bring awareness to those who are going in national parks and forests and are hiking to just be very aware of what's going on. But it makes you wonder, maybe something happened to him that they don't want the public to know about. What do you think? On a clear morning in early October of '96, a ranger at Yosemite National Park had received an urgent radio call. A hiker had been reported missing in the backcountry, specifically in an area called Tenaya Canyon. He knew this wasn't good news. Tenaya Canyon had a bad reputation among staff that they'd actually put up warning signs at the entrance that said, "Travel beyond this point is dangerous." The thing was, this wasn't even the first call about the canyon that day. In fact, earlier in the morning, another individual had already been reported missing in the exact same area. 2 separate groups, 2 separate incidents, but both in Tenaya Canyon on the same day. This ranger immediately organized search teams, and over the following hours, as they combed through the rugged canyon with its slick granite walls and treacherous waterfalls, they were hoping they'd find these hikers, maybe injured, but at least alive. But by the end of the day, they'd found both hikers, and both were unfortunately deceased. I know, this video's dark. Just bear with me here. 2 separate accidents, 2 separate locations within this place, both fatal on the same day. Of course, tragic accidents happen in national parks all the time, right? You have people who slip on wet rocks, or they fall off cliffs, or, they fall into crevasses, or they get eaten by wildlife, or die from exposure, right? There's a myriad of things and reasons. And it's extremely heartbreaking, but it's not mysterious. But when word of these 2 deaths spread among park staff, particularly the older rangers who'd been there for decades, they all had the same thought. You see, a lot of people call it superstitious, but there's some weird stuff happening. And to understand everything, we really need to go back in time. This canyon had earned itself a nickname. People call it the Bermuda Triangle of Yosemite. And there's a very specific reason why. And in fact, we're going to go back to March 27th of 1851. On that morning, a group of armed men on horseback rode into Yosemite Valley. This was the Mariposa Battalion, a volunteer militia that had been authorized by the state of California, and they were led by James Savage and Captain John Bowling. These men had come here for one purpose: to forcefully remove the Native Americans who lived in the valley. The natives who lived in Yosemite weren't just passing through or, hanging out temporarily. The Awenatchee people had been living in and around this valley for at least thousands of years, and by this point, they had their own name for it. They called it Ahwahnee, which meant place of the gaping mouth. But the Awenatchee who were living there in 1851 were actually relatively recent returnees to the valley. You see, around 1800, a devastating epidemic had swept through their villages, and their survivors had been forced to abandon their ancestral home and seek refuge with neighboring tribes. And one of those survivors was a young man named Tenaya, the son of an Ahwahnee chief. But In the 1830s, when Tenaya had grown up and become a leader himself, he made a decision. He was going to lead his people back to their homeland, and by 1833, he and his band had resettled in Yosemite Valley, in the land of their ancestors. Now, the neighboring tribes had a name for Tenaya's band. They called them Yosemite, which meant those who kill or killers. And it was apparently a reference to their fierce reputation as warriors, and that name would eventually be adopted as the name of the entire valley. Now, for about 18 years, Tenaya and his people lived very peacefully, but in 1848, gold was discovered in California and everything changed. I'm sure many of you watching this are very familiar with the history here. And within just a few years, the indigenous population in the southern Sierra fell from several thousand to just a few hundred. They were killed by disease, violent starvation. I mean, you had their food sources destroyed. And so in late 1850, a trading post on the Fresno River was attacked and its perpetrator was killed. Whether this was actually done by Tenaya's people or not became the excuse for what would happen next, right? So there's your backstory, and now we kind of get to what's really happened. California then authorized the formation of the Mariposa Battalion to deal with what they called the Indian problem. So on that morning, when the battalion rode in, they became the first non-indigenous people known to have ever entered this sacred place. And they didn't come in peace. It was awful. They immediately began setting fire to the villages, and horrifically, they shot anyone who tried to resist or flee. At least one tribal elder was captured and hanged from a tree. Chief Tenaya himself was captured, and around 70 to 80 of his people, as sadly as it is, mostly women and children, were rounded up like cattle. And the militia forced the captives to march on foot all the way to the Fresno River to a makeshift reservation camp. But they wanted to make sure Tenaya wouldn't try anything, so they took his sons as hostages. Now, among the battalion was a doctor named Lafayette Bennell, who would later write about what he witnessed that day. According to him, as the captured were being marched away, Tenaya's youngest son suddenly tried to make a run for it, and thinking maybe he could escape or just got scared, whatever it was, well, we know what happened. When Chief Tenaya saw his son fall, there's just something that changed on his face. It's like he immediately stopped walking, and he just turned to face the soldiers. And even though he was in chains, even though he was surrounded by armed men who had destroyed everything he knew and loved, he spoke in a voice that Bennell said he would never forget. Now, the exact words he used have been debated by historians, but some versions focus specifically on the canyon that would later bear his name. Tenaya invoked a curse upon the land, saying that the valley would bring death to those who had stolen it. He said the spirits of his ancestors would ensure that this place would never know peace, that it would claim the lives of the invaders just as they had claimed the lives of his people. Of course, all the soldiers laughed at him. They thought it was just the ravings of a defeated old man, and all the people were marched away to the reservation. Tenaya would eventually escape and try to return to the valley, but unfortunately, the world he knew was gone forever. In 1864, Yosemite was granted to California as a park, and in 1890, it became a national park. Now, as for that specific canyon where Tenaya was said to have focused part of his curse, it was named Tenaya Canyon, presumably in his honor. But almost from the beginning, people noticed strange things about the place. I mean, there's just an energy there. In 1873, just 22 years after Tenaya's curse, the famous naturalist John Muir was exploring the canyon when he had a serious fall that nearly killed him. He later wrote about the experience, describing the canyon as having an almost malevolent feeling to it. Over the following decades, this canyon developed its reputation, like I told you guys earlier, as the Bermuda Triangle of Yosemite. People would get lost there, and people would slip and fall in conditions that shouldn't have been dangerous in the first place. Search and rescue teams reported equipment failures, sudden weather changes, and even an overwhelming feeling of being watched. Going back to the present, by the time the two hikers died on the same day in '96, the reputation was so bad that, like I said, the park had already put up warning signs. Interestingly, if you visit there today and talk to the rangers about this canyon, you'll get an array of different responses. Some people believe it's all hogwash, it's superstition, whatever, but there are those that really do believe there is something mysterious and supernatural going on with that canyon. But regardless of whether there's really a curse or not, this place is very dangerous, and people still tragically die with disturbing regularity. Now, whether you believe in curses or not is irrelevant, because there's just something really unsettling about hiking through a place where less than 200 years ago, a grieving father stood in chains watching his son die and spoke words that people still remember today. And now that I think about it, unfortunately, if this place really is cursed and there's crap going on, the public will never be made aware. While our first two cases took place in and around Yosemite, this last one takes place a little bit more north in Sequoia National Park. I've saved the best for last. This one is pretty wild. It's out there. At around 4 in the morning on a summer night in 1975, a man named John Clark was fast asleep in his trailer at a campsite in Sequoia National Park in California. John was there with his wife and his good friend Ralph Johnson, and they'd already been camping for several days at this point. They were enjoying the wilderness and getting away from their regular lives and all the stress that comes with that. John's dog was sleeping on the floor of the trailer, and everything was relatively quiet. But suddenly, John's dog just jumped up and started barking like crazy, hackles raised. Rawr! And initially, John, is kind of in that groggy, half-awake state, and he's pretty annoyed, thinking that this stupid dog woke me up for a stupid raccoon, rustling around outside, and he's yelling at his dog to just cut it out, go back to sleep, and he's trying to toss and turn, but his dog wouldn't stop. He's going ballistic, growling in a way that John wasn't used to hearing. And after a few minutes of this, he's like, okay, maybe there's a bear outside, like there's something to this. So he sat up, he looked over at his wife, who was also now awake, and they're thinking, what's going on here? Well, when they heard their friend Ralph, who was sleeping in his car nearby, he was yelling something. John couldn't quite make out what Ralph was saying, but he sounded really scared. So John quickly got out of bed, looked out the window of his trailer, and even though it was really dark, there was just enough light from the moon that he could see their campsite pretty clearly. And what he saw, it just didn't make any sense. There was this massive figure moving through their camp. John was like, oh, this is a bear. They're in Sequoia National Park. I mean, there's a lot of black bear. But his eyes adjusted more, and he realized, even though it looked like a bear, the movements were very different. For starters, this was walking on two legs, and it walked like it was used to being on two legs, bipedal. It had to have been at least 9 feet tall, and so he's still thinking it's a black bear. Like, this has got to be the largest black bear I've ever seen, but the more he looks at it, the more he has to talk himself out of rationale and logic, because he's like, this just doesn't make sense. And all the while this is happening, his eyes are adjusting more to the light, and he could start to make out more features of this. I mean, all this is taking place within, a matter of seconds, of course. And he could see what looks like blonde or light-colored hair all over its body. But the strangest thing was how it moved, because it wasn't walking with the typical up and down motion that you and I have when we walk. It kind of like glided across the ground and kept its upper body perfectly level as it moved. And by now, his wife had joined him at the window, and they're both watching this. They have no idea what's going on. They don't know what they're looking at. They're frozen. They're terrified. And then they see Ralph, and he's got a frying pan in his hand. And he throws it at the thing, and the pan just bounces off the thing, and it doesn't even react. There's no sound. It doesn't speed up or slow down. It just keeps moving with this strange, smooth motion. And now Ralph is in full panic mode, right? You don't just get hit by a cast iron pan and don't react. So he runs to his car, jumps inside, and you could actually hear him locking on the doors. And John's now in full panic mode, if he wasn't already. And the only thing going in his mind is, I need to protect my wife. I have to do something. So he reaches over, grabs his rifle that he had brought for protection, and he tells his wife, stay down and be quiet. And so she gets down, and he's looking. And for the next several hours until the sun came up, he just sat there with his rifle, watching, waiting. And whatever it was that had been gliding around their camp, for whatever strange reason, had disappeared. But John wasn't about to take any chances. Now, his dog eventually stopped barking, but remained very agitated, whining and whimpering, pacing around the trailer. I mean, it was evident that everything about this situation was very wrong. And of course, you could hear Ralph in his car every once in a while. He'd start the engine like he was thinking about driving away, but then he'd turn it off again. Now, when the sun finally came up and it was fully light outside, he felt safe enough to finally go out. Ralph got out of his car too, and he looked terrified. He was shaking, he was pale, and he just said to John, "Did you see that thing?" And all three of them spent the next couple of hours searching all around, looking for any evidence of what they had seen. They looked for prints, any broken branches, any sign, fur, anything that they could use to prove that this happened. They didn't find anything. There wasn't a track, even though the ground was soft. It's like they had this shared hallucination. None of it made sense. And because they were so sleep deprived by this point, they were shaken up. They're just like, you know what? Let's just pack up and call it a day. But John's wife couldn't let it go. And so even though they went home, the very next day, she did something that John thought was strange. She went out and got a Ouija board. Now, John had never been into any of this hocus pocus kind of stuff, right? To him, it's just like, we don't mess with that. But his wife is like, no, maybe if we use this board, maybe we can contact spirits and get an answer as to what this was. So he humored her. They sat up the board on the kitchen table. She put her fingers on the planchet, and folks, they started asking questions. Now, of course, nothing happened at first, but then they kept asking it more, and they waited, and, well, eventually, the planchet started moving, and it spelt out QON. John's wife asked what QON meant. The board indicated it was a name, and so she asked where QON was from, and the board spelled out that it was from 5 million light years away. This is like something straight out of a science fiction movie. It was wild. Now, of course, John, seeing all of this, is getting very uncomfortable, but his wife just kept going and asking questions. And so she began to ask it if it had anything to do with what they saw at the campsite. The board, of course, said yes. And so she began asking it more questions. And it gets stranger. The board spelled out Bigfoot, but then came this really strange answer. John's wife asked if Bigfoot was from Earth, and the board said no, that Bigfoot was actually an alien that had crashed on Earth in 1863, and that it had come from the planet Pluto. Pretty wild, I know. Now, John, by this point, had had enough. He thought the whole thing was just getting so ridiculous, and he's also extremely freaked out from the camping experience and everything that had gone on up until this point, without adding the whole alien thing into the mix. And so he then stopped his wife and convinced her to put the Ouija board away, and they would actually end up throwing it in the trash. Now, as they tried to move on with their lives, what had happened left such a imprint on John's mind that he began developing severe sleep issues. He just began having horrific nightmares, and it was to the point to where he was suffering from insomnia. And about 3 or so weeks goes by, and he decided he needed help. Now, he had heard about a professor at the University of California by the name of Dr. James Harder, who at the time was known for researching UFOs and other unexplained phenomena. Now, even though John had never believed in any of that stuff before, he was so desperate for answers. So he reached out to Dr. Harder, told him the whole story, and, not surprised, Dr. Harder was very interested. And he simply suggested that John undergo hypnosis because sometimes people block out traumatic or unusual experiences, and hypnosis could help recover those memories. Of course, John was skeptical, but he agreed to try it. And so he went to the office, and, he was put under hypnosis, taking him back to that night. And at first, John was just describing what he'd already remembered. The dog barking, seeing the creature, the way it moved. But then something changed. While he was under hypnosis, John began remembering things he hadn't remembered before. And he remembered that when he was watching the thing through the window, there was a moment where everything went bright white. And the next thing he knew, he wasn't in his trailer anymore. He was in this triangular room, and he couldn't see any doors or windows, just smooth walls that seemed to glow with their own light. And he was lying on some kind of table. He tried to move, but he couldn't. He could feel something in his arm, like a tube or an IV, and there was another tube in his stomach. And then he felt himself being lifted up, but not by hands, but like he was levitating. And as he was floating there, he looked up and he saw this brilliant white light above him. But then as his eyes adjusted, there was something in the light. There were eyes looking down at him. these yellow eyes with black slits, like a cat's eyes or reptiles, but much larger. And John was trying to see more, trying to see what kind of being these eyes belonged to, but he couldn't make out a body. His mind just couldn't process what he was seeing, and all he could focus on were the eyes. And suddenly, it was over. He was back in his trailer, looking out the window, and now under hypnosis, he understood that missing time, that moment of bright white light. He hadn't just seen something, something had taken him. When Dr. Harder brought John out of hypnosis, he was very traumatized. He was sweating and shaking. He couldn't believe what he just remembered, and it felt real. More real than a dream or imagination, but it felt impossible. Dr. Harder broke the news to him that his experience was not unique, that he'd worked with many others who'd had similar encounters, seeing a creature or a being and missing time, and then under hypnosis, remembering an abduction experience. He said that there seemed to be some connection between Bigfoot sightings and UFO activity. Why? We don't know. Nobody really understood what the connection was. Unfortunately for John, he was more confused now more than ever, and he didn't have any answers. Had he really been abducted? Was Bigfoot really an alien from Pluto? Or was his mind just trying to make sense of something so strange that defied everyday logic that he created false memories? Now, believe it or not, Dr. Harder is right that there are many people who have had very similar experiences, and unfortunately, a lot of them take place in national parks. More specifically in California, just because there's a much higher volume of people going into those places. And that's it, folks. The postulates suggest a conspiracy to cover up anything like this that happens in all national parks and wilderness areas in the state of California. Why? That remains a mystery. And because you made it to the very end, I want you to all comment below, California knows. So that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural in a cinematic storytelling fashion, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.